Okay, so tuberous sclerosis, a disorder that's already been mentioned once or twice this evening, and it won't talk about this one will, I think. So, yeah, I'm going to really be talking about going from gene to a targeted treatment for tuberous sclerosis, and it's actually a very long story. It's going to be very compressed this evening. The partners that are involved in this all have been absolutely critical, and none more so, than the patients and families and the patient organisations. So the Tuberous Sclerosis Association here in the UK and the TS Alliance in the USA were really critical in bringing patients to the research throughout the 20-odd years that I'm summarising in 15 minutes, and also providing key funding in at times when perhaps rare disease research was pretty difficult to get funded anywhere else. So thanks to the TSA and the TS Alliance. And then the other partners, obviously the NHS and other healthcare systems in other countries, very much an international story. Lots of universities involved, a number of drug companies, most recently and notably Novartis, and then government have played, and government organisations have played roles too, both in terms of funding, so been some from the MRC, for example, but also in terms of progressing advances through to policy. And there's been a really, I think, a good relationship here in Wales for doing this, and now with the Rare Disease Implementation Plan, there's a real emphasis on getting research into clinical practice here in Wales. So the disorder, just for those who haven't heard of it, is one in which tumours develop in many organs of the body, and the ones I'll be mentioning particularly are kidney tumours called angiomyolomas. So this is a kidney, and this is a tumour, and brain tumours or subependymal giant cell astrocytomas, so just all those SEGAs, and here's a child's head with a tumour and resultant hydrocephalus. So lots of tumours which are, although often not malignant, nonetheless pretty serious because of where they are and what they do. And then the second sort of set of problems that people with tuberous sclerosis are very prone to are the neurological and psychiatric manifestations. So all sorts of neurocognitive problems, neurodevelopmental problems, so we've heard about autism and ADHD earlier, and the vast majority, nearly all patients have epilepsy, and this can be very resistant to conventional anti-epileptic drugs. So the genetic basis was actually resolved during the 1990s by positional cloning, and that was in the era before the Genome Project was really active, and so it was a rather laborious process, but it produced, during the 1990s, 2 genes, either of which, when mutated, result in tuberous sclerosis. And once those genes were in the hands of researchers, then really we could get to the pathophysiology of the condition and start to think realistically about identifying drug targets. Before that, really, the pathophysiology had been a complete mystery. So the TSC1 and 2 genes were placed on a signalling pathway reasonably quickly in animal models. And you can see on the left there, those left-hand panels show a fruit fly, or Drosophila, which has a mutation of one of the TSC genes, and you can see that the organs have overgrown in the eye and the wing hairs there. And so this was, a really useful advance, but didn't pin down the precise point at which these genes were impacting this growth pathway. And once the Drosophila geneticists had identified this pathway, very quickly it was knocked out in mouse models, and the same pathway was shown to be activated. So this is a tumour developing in a transgenic mouse kidney, which shows staining that indicates that this same pathway is activated. So at least we had a pathway, but where to act in the pathway in thinking therapeutically. And the big advance here was made in 2003 by a number of groups, including my colleague Andy T, who I thought was going to be here this evening, but he isn't, unfortunately, otherwise I could have embarrassed him. But basically what he showed was that TSC1 and TSC2 regulate this key molecular complex called the mTOR complex 1, or mTOR1, through an intermediary, a small protein. So when the TSC genes work, basically this mTOR complex 1 its activity is restrained, it's damped down. If the TSC genes are mutated, as they are in people with tuberous sclerosis, this complex becomes overly active. That's why I've indicated it in green. And this suggested that if mTOR inhibitors could be used in patients with tuberous sclerosis, they might damp this activity back down again and reverse the problems. So, so really having the genes and then working out what they did identified the target. And indeed there are mTOR1 inhibitors, and this is why this is very relevant to this idea of repurposing drugs. So a drug called Rapamycin or Everolimus had been isolated bizarrely from a soil sample on Easter Island, and this is a little plaque in Easter. So these are what we think of as the stones in Easter Island. In fact, somewhere near this stone is where the soil sample came from which this little bug was isolated, from which rapamycin was purified. And this plaque, I can't read, it's in Portuguese, but basically it says something along the lines of, people from, I think it was Wyatt, Brazil, found a little soil sample here and isolated rapamycin. And so this is rapamycin on the left, that was isolated by Wyatt and came off patent, and therefore it's quite a cheap drug. But they weren't very interested really in pursuing it far in relation to tuberous sclerosis for exactly that reason. It was off patent, so it comes right back to what we're hearing back from Rick. So we asked the MRC actually to fund a trial of this drug in tuberous sclerosis, and they said no. So then we asked Novartis if they would fund a trial with their derivative, and they said yes. A number of trials have been done with their derivative because they think they can make some money out of it, I guess. So this was the phase 2 trial. So these were done with rapamycin. So this was a trial looking at the size of kidney lesions, these tumours in patients with tuberous sclerosis treated for 2 years with rapamycin. So this was a trial from Cardiff, and this was a similar trial from the US where they treated their patients for 1 year and then stopped the drug. And so you can see if you stop the drug, the tumours regrow. So it's not a cure, it is a treatment which controls the disease or improves the disease. But those phase 2 trials we didn't have to do phase 1, of course, because this was reprofiling. So it's straight into phase 2, so as I said, cheap and quick. And those results were picked up by Novartis, who were very interested and funded an international phase 3 trial, initially for these kidney tumours in patients with tuberous sclerosis. And these sort of graphs people will probably be used to, but this one shows the people who got Everolimus, their kidney tumours shrank, whereas people who got placebo, their tumours didn't shrink. And on the basis of this, the drug was actually licensed to treat these tumours in patients with tuberous sclerosis. And very similar findings in a parallel study done for the brain tumours in children with tuberous sclerosis. And you can see again, basically these tumours shrink on this treatment. And because it's a single gene Mendelian disease, there's a very homogeneous pathology to these things, so they all respond. It's not like the heterogeneous responses you get in sporadic tumours. And in fact, those responses are also sustained. Adverse events, common but mild, and so these adverse events were certainly not serious enough to prevent the license being granted now for both of those indications. And so the license, the licenses were issued in 2012, 2013. So we were very excited and thought, great, we can start to treat our patients, but of course it takes a couple more years before the NHS eventually catches up. But here in Wales in 2015, eventually the chief exec of the NHS wrote to the chairs of the health board saying, look, you've got to now allow your doctors to prescribe these drugs for this indication. So finally we could, from late 2015, start to prescribe the targeted therapy in the clinic. So for those growths, but the question I suppose that was very prominent in our minds, in the minds of families with family members affected by tuberous sclerosis, well, that's fine, but what about all these other problems? What about the epilepsy and the autism and the behaviour problems? Might these be helped by this same agent? You might think they would be, because they're part of the phenotype due to the same mutation. And there was some experimental evidence from, again, from animal models that suggested this may well work. So this top graph relates to a knockout of the TS gene in the mouse brain, in neurons in the mouse brain. And basically, these mice get epilepsy, and this curve shows that by day 60, if the gene isn't working in the mouse brain, they're all dead. And this line here is if you treat them with rapamycin, and basically 90% of them are still alive at 100 days. And this line is what happens if you treat for a while and then stop treatment. And it's a bit like those human trials. If you stop the treatment, the problem comes back. 5 minutes to go. There's the thing. I think we're fine. So that was, again, these preclinical findings were of great interest, and a trial was done in patients, quite a large trial, again, internationally. So, you know, rare diseases, difficult to find enough patients, so this was done across many countries, I think about 17 different countries. And sure enough, the same drug that treats the tumours treats the epilepsy. So you can see here there's increasing doses of rapamycin and increasing response rate and a reduction. So these are the proportions of patients on the treatment who have at least a 50% reduction in their seizures. And so that, again, is a very good result. It took a very long time to persuade Novartis that this was a good idea, because this was a drug that was in their oncology division. They didn't really think of it as an anti-epileptic, certainly not for a while. But it works, and so it's licensed, but we're still waiting for the funding process through the NHS to be able to prescribe this in the clinic in Wales. The bottom panel here about mice was just to say the mice also do have actually some memory problems and some socialisation problems, which may be a model for autism. So this shows the experimental setup where a mouse has the option of either visiting another little mouse or visiting some inanimate object. And the TS mice aren't very sociable. They don't go and spend their time with the second mouse. But if you give them rapamycin, they do. So we're also very interested in, would this drug have an impact on cognitive and behavioural problems in tuberous sclerosis? So there's a trial which is near to completion in the UK, in which patients come to the clinic here in Cardiff and have assessments, a bit like the assessments we were hearing about in the Imagine ID study. So, you know, an awful lot of doing things on computers and filling in questionnaires and so on. And the results are really eagerly awaited. We need, I think, something like 3 or 4 more patients to have complete recruitment to that trial, and then we'll be able to have a look at the data. It's a placebo-controlled trial and see what's going on. So, you know, it's an exciting story. There's no doubt that the treatment works. What we're really interested in the future is, can we use the same agent to prevent the problems occurring in the first place? A little bit like we've heard in relation to ectodermal dysplasia. So most of these graphs here show the age at which the problems develop in children with tuberous sclerosis. You can see really, you know, an awful lot happens in the first year of life. Many children develop seizures and then start to have developmental problems within the first year of life, although other problems like the kidney problems usually start considerably later. So early treatment, and we've done this, again, we've done this in the mouse models and shown that these agents will completely prevent the emergence of the tumour-related phenotypes. We don't yet know about some of the others. So, so there's a lot of interest in this, but also a lot of worry from paediatricians in particular about, well, you know, what might the consequences of using these agents be if they're applied very, very early in development. But I think most of the families in the TSA feel that these risks were taking, and so we're very hopeful that this trial will get going soon. So that was all I was going to say. 1 minute to go, so I can answer any questions.